Chapter 2. Dreams and Realities. During the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression, the American people underwent a frightening interlude of uncertainty and anxiety. In many ways, my own life at that time paralleled the strange odyssey of the nation as a whole. As the Roaring Twenties faded into history, I found myself trapped in a set of discouraging circumstances, my personal goals temporarily thwarted. But again, like the experience of the nation, out of that period of disappointment came a time of great hope and a renewed sense of purpose in my life. Between the great crash of 1929 and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, I struggled through my education, both in school and in the world at large. I met and married the girl of my dreams, and I discovered my life's work. The decade was a season of growth during which I built the foundations for exciting years that followed. By the close of that era, I had accomplished some of my dreams of my childhood, while others had been tempered by reality. My first dream centered on a college education. Originally, I had hoped to attend the University of Arkansas, but because I feared finding readers in Fayetteville would be difficult, I chose Little Rock Junior College instead. LRJC proved to be an excellent selection, since the change from the School for the Blind left me in a temporary state of confusion. In high school, we only had 3 or 4 students in each class, while college classes ranged from 25 to 30 people. I could not read the blackboard, and even though I could write some because I had gone through the 3rd grade in public school and understood the theory of writing, my abilities were inadequate for college work. The School for the Blind never required written work, and it took a lot of practice to be able to write as well as my classmates at LRJC. Another shock involved the amount of reading required. Since I could not afford a formal reader, my father and my younger sister Zelma read all my lessons aloud in the evenings. Even with their help, I sometimes felt I would never complete the necessary assignments in courses like history and literature. An important skill I did cultivate from that experience involved training my mind to outline material as it was being read and then seize the important points. Years later, I found this aptitude to be one of the most valuable faculties I developed in school. Although the time needed for my academic work combined with hitchhiking 8 miles between Ironton and the campus limited my extracurricular activities, I tended to make the most of the opportunities I had. People with visual handicaps often work extra hard to prove they can do what other people are doing, and I was no exception. I joined several service and social clubs, and although I couldn't participate in football or basketball, I did make the track team, anchoring the mile relay and running the quarter mile. I remember one of my happiest moments in college occurred during a dual track meet with Monticello A&M. Their relay team was far ahead by the time I received the baton for the last lap, and since I couldn't see how far behind I was, I started running as hard as I could. Having spent what felt like my last ounce of energy, I caught the A&M anchorman a few yards from the finish line and surged past him to win. I have always regarded that race as one of the more symbolic events of my youth. I liked to compete, and as a result, my biggest disappointment in college came when the faculty denied me the opportunity to participate on the debating team. Since I intended to become a lawyer, I knew how important debating could be for my future. The instructors who coached the team, however, had other ideas. They told me that even though I qualified for the team, they did not think it would be a good plan for me to debate because the time involved might harm my other studies. I regarded the whole experience as a severe blow, but one that seemed typical, being visually handicapped and having well-meaning people decide what is good for you instead of allowing you to decide for yourself. I remember I did receive some gratification when a young girl who made the team came to me one afternoon and confessed she did not know anything about debating and asked me to coach her. I agreed, and much of my satisfaction, by the end of the year, she became one of the best debaters on the squad. I had another upsetting experience in school, but this one did not surprise me at all. An instructor at the college took a personal interest in me, and when he found out about my plans regarding the law, he arranged an appointment for me with a prominent downtown attorney named Graham Hall. When I went to see Hall, he immediately began to point out all the problems a visually handicapped person would have in trying to study law. He droned on until finally eyesight seemed to be the only requirement necessary to become an attorney. I know he meant well, but I didn't relish the discouragement. In October of my first year at Little Rock Junior College, the stock market collapsed and pervasive clouds of gloom began to settle over America. The following summer, Arkansas experienced a terrible drought that ushered in the Great Depression. What that era meant in personal terms was there would be no money for education, no more LRJC. My family took a fatalistic view, saying, "Come on home, Roy, and we will all starve together." Only I wasn't about to starve. I had dreams. I was still going to become a lawyer, but I did realize that for the time being my dreams could have to take a back seat to some harsh realities. During my last year at the School for the Blind, a salesman passed through Ironton selling Bibles to earn money to go to college. My father invited him to spend the night with us, and the younger man convinced me I, too, could become a Bible salesman. As a result of that one conversation the next summer, I hitchhiked to Nashville, Tennessee, to take a week-long course in salesmanship from a company called Southwestern Book Publishers. After the lessons, I journeyed to Charleston, South Carolina, to begin my career as a door-to-door Bible salesman. The whole summer provided me with a cornucopia of life experiences. For example, the school taught us never to argue with anyone. If the lady of the house told you black was white, you did not have to agree with her. You just said, "Come to think of it, black is a peculiar color." Since Bibles were my business, oftentimes people would want to discuss religion, and I found this to be a broadening expansion of my education. Being a staunch Baptist from rural Arkansas, I had no idea there was such a variety of religious interpretations. Methodist, Presbyterian, Jehovah's Witness, Catholic, Jewish. That summer I began a lifelong interest in the nature of religion and comparative faiths. The summer of 1929, I traveled the back country of South Carolina with a sample case of family Bibles, teachers' Bibles, enlargement Bibles, and other religious books. The system required that we leave headquarters on Monday morning and not return until Saturday afternoon. We were on our own to live on whatever we collected and on the hospitality of the good people of South Carolina. Around 4 o'clock each afternoon, I would begin to look for someone in the neighborhood who might be willing to put me up for the night. Usually I would sell that person a Bible and then deduct a small credit for lodging. Selling was a rigorous life, and many of my fellow Bible salesmen became homesick and quit. Once I even recruited 4 or 5 of my friends from the School for the Blind, but they all lacked the determination to see the project through. On several occasions I had to postpone a meal until I could make another sale because my pockets were empty. I also suffered continuing problems with my sight. The summer sun irritated my eyes, and I never knew what I might wake up and find them swollen shut. I had to memorize the prospectus in order to demonstrate to the customers how to use the Bible as a reference source and hide the fact I couldn't read the material. In retrospect, this situation seems ironic because today we train people to accept their handicap and not try to conceal it. The company challenged us to sell on holidays, and I remember working on the 4th of July because our supervisor told us we could celebrate Independence Day by being independent enough to get out and work. But the second summer I sold Bibles, independence was not enough. The ravages of the Depression hit rural South Carolina with colossal force, and few people had enough money to purchase a new Bible. Even those who signed up to buy one at the beginning of the summer had no money to pay me when I made my deliveries in August. When I realized there would not be sufficient money to return to college in the fall of 1930, I set out to earn enough funds to finance my education the following year. Since selling books could not produce the needed income, I secured a position with an insurance company. I sold a variety of small policies and had to go back to the policy holders and collect 5 cents each week. A lot of work for a minuscule return. I moved on to selling magazines door to door on a commission basis with a group called the Women's Home Companion Reading Club. We sold magazine combinations and rotated work crews between Little Rock, Fort Smith, Texarkana, and Shreveport. I had a little more success at this job, and when the company offered me a higher paying position in Jackson, Mississippi, I headed for the Magnolia State. While living in Jackson, I flirted with the idea of attending law school there and perhaps getting involved in Mississippi politics. I quickly discovered this plan would never be more than a dream, since Mississippi politicians were born, not bred. Several friends politely informed me that if you did not come from the right families in the state, you would always be considered an outsider. After a while, the magazine business dried up, and I drifted back to selling Bibles, this time in the coal mining areas of West Virginia. 1 year quickly turned into 2, and the 2 stretched into 3. Each year I would think, surely next year I will make it back into school, but as time went on, my disappointment became critical. Still determined to be a lawyer, I felt the sting of inaction, unable to move toward my life's goal. In those days, if you were married, that ended any hope of education because you had to work to support your wife and family. So I vowed I would not think about marriage until I had my law degree, and again I felt paralyzed. The years between 1930 and 1936 were disillusioning and frustrating ones. All of my dreams deferred. But somewhere deep inside of me, I knew those dreams would someday become realities. I decided to become a lawyer around the age of 12. By then, my father served as the Justice of the Peace in Ironton, and since he had some political influence with the people in the community, politicians always called on him and visited our house. I also attended numerous political rallies in those days, and I observed that many important political figures into a political career. By the time I turned 16, I had found a hero and role model in a young gubernatorial candidate named Brooks Hayes. Not only an attorney and prominent politician, Hayes was also an active Baptist layman, a dynamic combination in the eyes of a young country boy. In 1926, I supported Hayes' candidacy for governor, despite the fact that my father actively campaigned for his opponent, Harvey Parnell. I made my maiden political speech on Hayes' behalf, and although I'm not sure how many votes my speech swayed, I know over the summer I talked one person into voting my way. That was the first year my mother qualified to vote by paying a poll tax, and after much discussion I convinced her to vote for Brooks Hayes. My father always laughed about the split in the family and good-naturedly threatened to never pay another poll tax for my mother since she wouldn't support his candidate. At that time I still hoped my sight would somehow return to normal, and I would pursue the same path as Brooks Hayes. By 1936 I had become more realistic about my handicap, but just as determined to pursue my career. During a visit to Little Rock, I ran into an old classmate from my junior college days who attended the night law school in the city. He was enthusiastic about his studies, and the school sounded like a wonderful opportunity. After several sleepless nights, I decided to compromise on my dream of having another full year of college and enrolled in that same night law school. Since I needed financial assistance to continue my education, I talked to the superintendent at the School for the Blind about the possibilities of a stipend to hire a reader. I even got my father to come to the courthouse in Little Rock and inquire about special assistance for tuition or books, but he also found that nothing was available. I remembered a couple of crippled students at junior college who I knew had received financial aid from the state, so I pursued the matter. What I discovered shocked me. Under the existing vocational rehabilitation law, blind people were considered non-feasible. The state could spend money for vocational training, but this meant short-term training, like assisting a man who lost a leg to learn to be a bookkeeper or a cobbler. The rehabilitation people informed me that they considered the blind non-feasible because the cost of aiding them would exhaust most of the department's annual appropriation. Eventually, I secured an appointment with Ashley Ross, the head of vocational rehabilitation. He was a kind gentleman and finally agreed that under the circumstances the state could provide half of my law school tuition. The next year, since my grades were good, Mr. Ross expanded my aid to include the cost of my books and all of my tuition. Although I sold cemetery lots and clerked at J.C. Penney's store to pay for my room and board in town, I was extremely grateful for the state aid. I could not have completed my studies without Mr. Ross's help, and my dream of becoming a lawyer would never have come true. When I finished law school in 1938, the economic problems of the Depression had still not been solved, and rather than hang out my shingle as a fledgling attorney, I accepted a temporary position with the Rural Electrification Administration. I had earlier served on a committee to secure electrical service for Ironton, and regarded my new position an expansion of that work. In coordination with the County Extension Office, I canvassed a 4-county area to extend the services of the First Electric Cooperative of Jacksonville. In the course of my job, I became acquainted with an elderly gentleman who lunched at a boarding house near our headquarters. One day the man approached me about representing a friend of his who, during a recent illness, had made arrangements with a woman neighbor to care for him. In return, he had deeded her a 40-acre tract of land. She had reneged on her part of the bargain, and when the man regained his health, I had my first law case. By recovering the client's property, I received a $250 fee, which was quite a handsome sum in those days, and I hoped the case would be the beginning of a long and distinguished legal career. But while the law had opened doors for other opportunities and held the hope of a promising future, along the way I had developed some new interests. My own experiences had led me to realize how much discrimination visually handicapped people suffered in terms of education, rehabilitation, and employment opportunities. My valedictory speech at the School for the Blind had been on the theme of service, and I wanted to channel some of that service into helping the blind. Although I didn't realize its significance at the time, an event had occurred in 1936 that ultimately gave me an opportunity to implement that service, and in turn altered the course of my life. In that year, the Congress of the United States enacted the Randolph-Shepard Act. This legislation provided for the establishment of vending stands to be operated by blind individuals in federal buildings throughout the country. The stands would sell newspapers, magazines, candy, and tobacco products, and would be licensed by the state agencies for the blind. Hailed as a major breakthrough in vocational opportunities for the visually handicapped, the Randolph-Shepard Act supplied the chance for thousands of blind persons to become self-supporting and demonstrate they would be competent, contributing members of the American workforce. Guy Smith, a blind chiropractic doctor and the president of the Arkansas School for the Blind Alumni Association, first alerted me to the act after he read an article on the subject in the Matilda Ziegler magazine for the blind. Since I chaired the alumni's legislative committee, I began to follow the progress of the bill and study the background of the legislation. The history of the act dated back to the early 1920s, when blind persons began operating lunch counters in individual plants in Ohio, Michigan, and some New England states. Most of these enterprises failed because of poor equipment and limited stock. A similar and more successful effort emerged at approximately the same time in New York City, where a municipal ordinance granted World War I veterans with service-connected disabilities preference in acquiring newsstand locations throughout the city. These pioneering ventures stimulated the imaginations of several people engaged in the work for the blind. In 1929, U.S. Senator Thomas D. Shull, who was blind himself, proposed a bill in Congress allowing blind people to operate vending stands in public buildings. But the bill was defeated, as was a similar one in 1933. Despite these reverses, the advocates of the vending stand legislation continued their campaign. Aided by the relentless and untiring efforts of Leonard A. Robinson, a blind attorney from Cleveland, Ohio, the stand lobby sought additional congressional support. In 1934, Robinson met Congressman Jennings Randolph of West Virginia at a Lions Club convention, and as a result of this encounter, Congressman Randolph became a powerful sponsor of the proposed program. A former Lions district governor, Randolph had been active in the club's site conservation program for several years. At the beginning of 1936, he introduced a vending stand bill in the House, while Senator Morris Shepherd proposed a similar piece of legislation in the Senate. A year after the Randolph-Shepard Act became law, a fascinating and individual named Joseph Klunk became the project's first administrator. And as Frances Kessler wrote in her excellent study, The Unseen Minority, Klunk became the right man in the right place at the right time. Blinded as a young adult, Joe Klunk's indefatigable spirit had enabled him to overcome many of the limitations of his handicap. After selling toiletries door to door, he had been a staff member of the Cleveland Society for the Blind in Toronto, Canada. He spent the next 9 years establishing a vending stand and industrial placement program for the blind of Canada before becoming the administrator of the stand program in the United States. Over the years, I worked closely with Joe, and we became good friends. I don't believe I ever met a more zealous and talented advocate of the blind than Joe Klunk, and I believe that much of the success of the vending stand program is directly attributable to his outstanding leadership. Under the provisions of the Randolph-Shepard Act, each state established a public agency to license the new vending stand operators and supervise their training and placement. The licensing agency also had the responsibility of finding local sponsors, recruiting blind operators, and locating public buildings in which a stand would operate. In Arkansas, we wanted the legislature to create a separate commission for the blind, but when the proposed legislation failed, we tried to influence an established state agency to assume the responsibility of coordinating the new program. After the head of the Vocational Rehabilitation Department rejected the project, the chief of the Welfare Department reluctantly agreed to allow his office to act as the licensing agency, and by the spring of 1939, the state was ready to inaugurate its first vending stand program. I was flattered when Welfare Commissioner John R. Thompson invited me to his office and offered me the position of supervisor of the new program. Ironically, I was not particularly interested in the job at the time. I had my law degree, my license to practice law, and had every intention of pursuing a legal career with perhaps a venture or two into the political arena. But at the same time, I was impressed with the possibilities of the vending stand program. In fact, the previous spring, I had delivered a speech to the annual meeting of the Arkansas Association for the Blind. I served as the president of the group that year, urging that the Welfare Department assume the duties that would normally be conducted by a commission in securing employment for the blind. I believed strongly in the employment opportunities for the blind who could not have their sight restored, and the Arkansas Gazette agreed with me in an editorial on my address. The editorial writer said that a state commission, as Roy Kumpe proposed, could meet a real need and render services of the most practical as well as appealing kind. Mr. Thompson had heard my remarks and consequently offered me the new position. Because I believed I could have a genuine impact in a relatively brief time, I accepted his proposal and launched my professional career in the work for the blind. Intending to stay 6 months at the most, I never dreamed the work would expand so rapidly or become a lifelong obsession. That June, I assumed my responsibilities as the supervisor of the state's new rehabilitation program for the blind. Immediately, I began contacting civic organizations to act as sponsors, recruiting blind vendors, and working with local officials to establish sites for the stands. I vividly recall the speech I delivered again and again that summer. Upon reflection, I realize the theme of that address has remained the cornerstone of my career. The blind do not want the pity or the sentimental gushing of sympathetic people. They want to work and be self-supporting. 85% of the blind in Arkansas lost their sight after they turned 21, and these are restless and uncomfortable individuals who wish with all their hearts they had steady employment so they might benefit rather than hinder the world. I worked closely with Joseph Klunk throughout the summer, and with his advisor and aide, by August I had created the Arkansas Employment Service for the Blind, Incorporated. The AESB functioned as a nonprofit corporation, with the Welfare Department funding in the administration of the program, and vocational rehabilitation, paying a fee to offset the cost of training blind people to operate the stands. The AESB sought loans to establish the stands, and the corporation, not the operators, repaid the loans. The welfare department, as the licensing agency, had to secure a location, select a blind person to be the operator, and furnish the equipment and original stock. We also adopted a constitution that provided for a set number of board members, including the 3 state officials who were directly involved in the services for the blind: the Commissioner of Welfare, the Superintendent of the State School for the Blind, and the Director of Vocational Rehabilitation. I wanted to include these people on the board to ensure that the program would always maintain close ties to the other agencies involved in rehabilitation. Even then, I recognized the need for cooperation among organizations involved in helping the blind. We all had the same goal: to help every blind person fulfill his or her own potential. And so I hope to minimize conflict by including these individuals in the decision-making process in the new program. Under this system, our first vending stand opened at the State Welfare Office at Little Rock on August 26, 1939. We selected Early Busby, a young graduate of the Arkansas School for the Blind, to operate the stand. For several years he had tried to support his blind wife and infant daughter, but until the stand opened, his only income had been from the sporadic sale of brooms and a small aid to the blind check from the welfare department. To him, the stand represented an opportunity to demonstrate his own competence and become an independent, self-sufficient member of society. This stand at the welfare office became a showcase for the program, and soon after it opened, I began traveling the state to recruit blind operators and establish new stands. Filled with enthusiasm for the new project, I could never have anticipated the obstacles I encountered that year. Whenever I located a visually handicapped person who seemed eager to become a stand operator, the family usually opposed the idea. They didn't believe their blind relative had the ability to manage a vending stand on his own. The blind person had always been so helpless, passing the days in a rocking chair on the front porch or hidden away in the back bedroom. Many blind individuals had lived this way for 10 or 15 years. I remember one particular case near Monticello in Drew County. I had a difficult time locating a prospect until I heard about a blind man who lived out in the country. He shared a tiny farmhouse with his wife and parents, and when I arrived I found him sitting alone on the front steps, spending the day in idleness as he had done every day since he was blinded 10 years earlier. I talked with him for a while, and discovered the only thing he had done during that decade that he considered productive was the one day his family had allowed him to pick off peanuts. He had been able to pick off as many as some of the sighted members of the family, and he talked endlessly about the event as if a miracle had occurred. After I explained the stand program to him, he seemed willing to try, even though the job necessitated moving into Monticello. I helped him find a new home in town, and the first day the stand opened, his wife dutifully brought him to the courthouse. She found a chair in a far corner of the building for him, and then went behind the counter to wait on customers. When I told her that was her husband's job, she pursed her lips into a tight line of disbelief. "He can't work," she said. "He's blind. Blind people can't work." I had a difficult time convincing her I could teach her husband to operate the stand by himself. Even after I got her to agree to go home, she only went across the street to see what would happen. After 10 years of being told he was helpless, the man had no confidence in his own abilities. Gradually, I taught him how to identify money, how to keep his stand clean, how to order and display his stock. I instructed him to rotate his goods to avoid selling stale or spoiled items. Most importantly, I tried to impress on him the idea that his stand had to be tidy and well operated. I did not want people to buy from him because he was a poor blind man. I wanted them to frequent the stand because it offered quality merchandise in a well-run place of business. Slowly, my efforts began to pay the dividends. The man learned to operate the stand, and as an employee of the AESB, he became self-supporting and functioned as a productive citizen of his community until the end of his life. Overcoming the family's initial skepticism was only one problem in recruiting stand operators. Another barrier was the fact that many blind people feared that they would lose their monthly check from the welfare department if they took a job. Although only a small check, the money represented a contribution to the family's well-being, and they had a horror of losing it. In rural areas, blind people were often hidden away, the result of some popular myths surrounding the loss of sight. One predominant notion I had encountered was that blindness is a punishment for some past sin. Parents of blind children often confessed to me they believed their child's condition was God's retribution for their own misdeeds. Again and again I heard otherwise intelligent people, in referring to a blind citizen of their community, say, "I can't imagine what he did to deserve that." Many people also had the opinion that unless a person lost his sight in an accident of some kind, he probably went blind as a result of venereal disease. In those days, guilt and shame played an important role in ideas about blindness. Loss of sight meant evil and darkness. Those being punished were forced to grope in the dark. Unhappily, these images of blindness are not limited to rural areas, but too often persist in more sophisticated segments of society, perpetuated by the mythology, literature, and biblical stories of Western civilization. For example, the ancient Greeks often murdered blind infants, assuming they would always be a liability to society. This bizarre practice received the approval of both Plato and Aristotle, two of the Western world's most eminent philosophers. In Sophocles' famous play Oedipus the King, at one point the chorus summarizes many individuals' attitudes on blindness by saying, "Thou wert better dead than living and blind." Even the Bible contributes to these uninformed attitudes, characterizing blind people as groping, stumbling, and unable to find their way, in Deuteronomy 28, verses 28 to 29. In my travels, I found many sighted people who regarded all blindness as a contagious disease and constantly avoided recently blinded friends or relatives. Most people scoffed at the idea that the blind individuals in their community could ever be anything but objects of charity, and some even told me they thought it would be cruel to make blind people work. Throughout the winter of 1939 and 1940, I crisscrossed the state of Arkansas, combating these myths and opening new stands. I spoke to hundreds of Lions clubs, Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, and other civic organizations. I visited every county in the state, soliciting the aid of county and municipal officials who would allow us to operate a stand in the local courthouse. Joseph Klunk told me the program in Arkansas would be regarded as a success if I could have 6 or 7 stands in operation within a year. By the fall of 1940, there were 16 stands in the state, all showing a profit. I was hooked. I believed in the program. I believed that blind people could learn to be self-supporting and independent. I also regarded the stand program as only a beginning. I could see unlimited possibilities for other programs, and I wanted to be a part of any future expansion in the rehabilitation of the blind. Some of my enthusiasm for my temporary career also stemmed from personal encounter with the incomparable Helen Keller. In October 1939, state officials scheduled Miss Keller to appear at the dedication of the new State School for the Blind on Markham Street. As president of the school's Alumni Association, I served on the dedication committee and joined Superintendent Finis Davis in greeting her on arrival at the old Union Railroad station. We met Miss Keller on the platform, and when I was introduced, she said, "Oh, Mr. Kumpe." She spoke in a monotone and pronounced my name Kumpe. Then she said, "We know about you, and we are glad that you are starting a program for the adult blind." I could not have been more flattered. A young man who had only been working in the field a few months, receiving recognition from one of the most inspirational figures of the 20th century. We escorted Miss Keller and her secretary and interpreter, Polly Thompson, to their suite at the Albert Pike Hotel. Miss Thompson had assumed this position when the famous Anne Sullivan Macy had died a few years earlier. A delightful person in her own right, Polly Thompson kept Miss Keller informed of the conversation by forming symbols and letters in her employer's hand. The entire afternoon melted into an enjoyable and stimulating experience, and I marveled at Miss Keller, imprisoned without sight or hearing, enjoying a cocktail, laughing at a joke, or commenting on various remarks by others in the group. We all felt Helen Keller's presence gave the school's dedication a highly special significance. During the ceremony, Governor Carl Bailey delivered a rousing speech, but just as he reached the point where he was to introduce Miss Keller, rain began to fall. Although the governor continued to read his notes until the ink ran all over the page, we had to move the proceedings into the school's auditorium. Because the indoor facility had a seating capacity of only around 250 people, many of the several thousand persons who had come to hear Miss Keller speak had to miss the opportunity of hearing her. Since I had already visited with our guest and wanted to give other people a chance, I did not attempt to get inside the auditorium. Several friends told me she rendered a wonderfully inspirational address despite the fact that the heat and humidity inside the auditorium became suffocating. I vividly remember that when the dedication ended and people emerging from the building seemed more soaked from perspiration than those who had remained outside in the rain. That evening I attended a dinner for Miss Keller at the Albert Pike Hotel, and again found her to be an exhilarating person. Although a socialist politically, she believed in self-help for the handicapped, and she made a comment quite applicable to my own work that night. "The blind do not want charity," she said. "They want useful work and their share of life's sweet accomplishments." During my student days at the School for the Blind, we often debated which was the most serious handicap, deafness or blindness. Of course, we always agreed that deafness was the worst. But when I saw a person who had both handicaps, and yet who graduated from college, who had been able to free a mind that might have otherwise been trapped forever, I drew encouragement for my own pursuits, much as a plant draws its strength from the sun. Actually, Helen Keller was not the only woman who influenced my life in 1939. In my last year of law school, I visited the office of Municipal Judge Harper Harb, because in those days a municipal judge could decide who represented an individual in court, and that individual did not always have to be a licensed attorney. I had a potential client who had asked me to represent him, and so I went to the judge's chambers to seek his permission. The judge had an attractive secretary named Bernice Gray, and I will have to confess that after meeting her, I was in no particular hurry to talk to Judge Harb. When I did get in to see the judge, he agreed to let me serve as the attorney for my client in his court. While I was certainly excited about this turn in my career, I found myself dreaming up additional excuses to visit the judge's office again. Finally, as manager of the ARC Law Yearbook, I decided to ask him to sponsor a page in our annual. When I returned to the courthouse, the judge could not see me. I learned later he was taking a nap, and Miss Gray and I had a nice visit. She told me to leave my material and she would make sure Judge Harb purchased the ad. When I came back a couple of days later, sure enough, she had secured the money. I found out that Miss Gray liked to dance, and several months later, after I received my first fee as an attorney, I invited her on a date. We attended a legislative ball at the old Rainbow Garden in the 555 building, where we shared a wonderful evening. Enjoying each other's company, we danced the night away, and Bernice and I have been dancing ever since. We were married over the Thanksgiving holiday in 1939 and left immediately for Jonesboro, where I had to open a new vending stand. The town featured a nice hotel, and we honeymooned on the state expense account. At that point, I realized my life was taking on a sharper focus. I had a partner with whom I could share my dreams, and I had found a new career in the field of rehabilitation. Within a few years, however, the vending stands became more of a challenge than I had anticipated. With the coming of the Second World War, keeping the stands operating became increasingly difficult. Every necessary commodity seemed to be in short supply. In pleading with our jobbers and other people for special quotas, I never made my request on the basis of sympathy. I argued instead that they were going to have less and less to put into the civilian market because the War Department had requisitioned 50% of their products to go to the Armed Force canteen. I reasoned that all of our stands were located in public buildings where the traffic would always be heavy and the stock could be more easily distributed, and I knew that a lot of small out-of-the-way filling stations and tiny grocery stores would be forced to close for lack of gasoline or rubber. Most of the suppliers agreed, and as a result, the volume of sales from the vending stands actually increased during the war. In 1943, Congress voted to amend the vocational rehabilitation statutes by enacting a measure sponsored by Representative Graham Barden of North Carolina and Senator Robert M. La Follette, Jr. of Wisconsin. The resulting Barden-La Follette Act, Public Law 113, drastically altered the whole concept of vocational rehabilitation to such a degree that the legislation is often referred to as the Magna Carta for agencies for the blind. The original Act of 1921 only provided for payment for vocational training. The new Act made available funds for physical restoration and pre-vocational training services that made the physically handicapped person capable of engaging in remunerative. The new Act made available funds for physical restoration and pre-vocational training services that made the physically handicapped person capable of engaging in remunerative employment. From the standpoint of the blind in Arkansas, the Barden-La Follette Act had an immeasurable impact. The vending stand program immediately expanded because the Act provided for tools, merchandise, and other equipment. Finally, the new legislation created the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, OVR, under the Federal Security Agency. In Arkansas, my office then shifted from the Welfare Department to Vocational Rehabilitation in the Department of Education. My main function remained the supervision of the STAND program through the Arkansas Employment Service for the Blind. But after 1943, I expanded the program into private buildings as well as public ones. We had already demonstrated that blind people were productive workers and therefore hoped to establish new locations in office buildings or industrial plants that wanted food service. One problem we were able to solve during this era was the inability of blind people to qualify for health insurance. Up to that time, insurance companies apparently assumed that blind people had more accidents than their sighted counterparts and were therefore poor insurance risks. By presenting factual data, including the safety records of blind workers, I convinced Lincoln National Life Insurance Company of Fort Wayne, Indiana, to accept a proposal for a group of life and hospitalization policy for the STAND operators. This proved to be a pioneering effort in that other blind groups were soon to purchase similar policies. Besides creating the STAND program in Arkansas, I successfully promoted a bill in the state legislature in 1944 to fund home teaching for the blind. Now called rehabilitation teachers, these home teachers were blind persons who visited the homes of newly blinded individuals and offered counseling and some basic life adjustment instruction. Finally, I also began locating jobs for blind people in defense plants during World War II. Many of these positions were highly skilled and paid excellent wages. Gradually, I realized I had more opportunities than I had competent blind people. This situation became increasingly frustrating because I knew that numerous blind people could have handled those jobs if they had some kind of pre-vocational training. They needed to learn mobility in order to travel independently back and forth from work, and many needed to improve their communication skills. I recognized the extent of this problem when I tried to recruit several blind people to come to Little Rock to train for the STAND program. I discovered that the people who ran the local hotels and boarding houses did not want blind lodgers. They were afraid blind people might start a fire or need someone to take them to the bathroom. Out of this experience, an idea occurred to me. What if we set up our own boarding house? What if we staffed it with people who understood about blindness and could teach the blind people who came there about how to get along in the city? The idea seized my imagination like nothing I had experienced before. Unable to sleep at night, I lay awake planning what the new facilities would be like. As I pursued my daily task, I realized more each day that blind persons needed to be trained psychologically and socially before they were trained vocationally. From that realization came the dream and then the reality that would shape the next 40 years of my life.